Now that you know how fall rise works, let's take a look at rise fall. And just like before, this has to be where it's one piece. With fall rise, we saw how the core idea or feeling was a pullback effect. So is rise fall the opposite? Yes. Or at least it can be, because all cases of rise fall structurally, because there's also emotional uses, but all cases structurally could be looked at as a rise fall together, or it could just be looked at as not. So the direct opposite of pull back would be push forward. And that is definitely true, but a slightly more accurate and much easier way to think about this is, instead of push forward, we're going to call it push down. And we'll see why as we go through the different cases. In addition, this push down effect could also be thought of as a limitation or restriction effect. And again, you'll see as we go through the cases what I mean by that. Now, just like last time, I want to start by giving you a few subconscious connections and related things so that we can kind of start to build an idea of what's going on here, and then we'll look at the different cases. The first connection is being too direct, or we could even say too forward. And a good easy example here would be in dating. You see someone that you like at a bar or something, you start talking to them. What most people do is, you talk for a little while, see if there's chemistry, and then, whatever happens. But let's say you just go up to somebody and you're like, hey, let's make out. That would be considered too direct, too forward. You're rushing ahead. Okay, you're sort of skipping over the first part where you talk to the person. And notice the connection here. Forward, you're pushing forward, sort of imposing on that person. And too direct, you are too much to the point. We talked about last time, to the point, literally, period. Now the next subconscious connection is going to seem completely different, but it is still connected under the surface. And that would be the phrase, at my limit. So if I say I'm at my limit, that means that I cannot continue. Okay, I cannot move forward. All right, maybe in a fight, I'm fighting somebody, so I'm a boxer. Okay, I'm going, we go 10 rounds, 15 rounds, 20 rounds, and I'm just exhausted. I can't fight anymore. I'm at my limit. Now notice, we can describe this as I am at the point where I cannot push forward. Now there's a connection, very, very close, sort of tangled up connection under the surface between the logic of the preposition to and the logic of the preposition at. Now I'll let you watch the lessons or read the book about that to get all the details, but the basic idea, if you say I'm going to the store, that's your end point, which is the logic of to. The logic of at is a specific point or bubble. So when you go to the store, you are now at the store. So if you're at your limit, you have gone to the point where you cannot go forward. Now, obviously, when we reach the end of a statement, we have that period, with that falling intonation. You've reached the point where you're at the end of the sentence. Note that this also implies that there is a weight on you, whether that's because you don't have any more energy or whatever. It's like there's a burden, there's something weighing you down in some abstract way because you can't put any more energy forward into the thing you're trying to do. And one more thing to keep in mind, when we talk about pushing down, let's say I literally push down on you. Well, I'm in some way restricting or limiting your movement. To be limited to something. An easy example using food, let's say, for example, lions eat meat, they don't eat plants. So we can say that lions are limited to meat as a source of food. In this case, that's their only option. Or what if I say, what is your favorite sea animal? Now, I'm not asking for your favorite animal in general. You are limited to sea animals. You can only choose from sea animals. Now you might have many options there, but if it's not a sea animal, you can't choose that. So we see there's this limitation or this restriction going on. Now the last little idea here that you're going to see how it works in some of the cases is to cut off, literally. And this is mostly important for the idea of the push down effect and how it can create a limitation. But let's say I have a carrot and I don't want the end of the carrot. So I take a knife and I push down on that part of the carrot and I'm separating that part of the carrot. To our first case, or statements and lists. Now we talked about or statements and lists in the rising intonation. And there's actually two ways that you can look at the or and the list rise-fall structure. One is to look at it as a rise-fall. One is to look at it as a rise and then maybe a fall. So we saw with or how we'll rise on the first option, fall on the second option. And we saw with lists how we'll rise on each item through the list, and then we do this partial fall to close it. In one way, you could look at this as just rising and then falling, not as one piece, because remember with or, for example, I could say, do you like cats or dogs? I'm sort of closing off, I'm limiting those two options. I'm saying pick one. Now, of course, you could still pick something else if you wanted to, but that's how it sounds, that's how it feels. I'm saying this or this. Or I could say, do you like cats or dogs? Okay. If we rise instead of falling to close the list, it feels more open. So because of that, you could look at it as it's a rise and then a fall, not as one piece. And with lists, the reason why you can look at this not as one piece is because we're rising, 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 and then falling. And so because we have multiple rises, it's not a rise fall. So it's possible to look at or and lists as a rise and a fall separate, but it is also perfectly fine to look at it as a rise fall combined. You can choose whichever one makes sense to you. It doesn't really matter. There are two ways to look at the same thing. But if we do look at it as a rise fall as one piece, how is that working and why is that working? Well, we know that the core idea or feeling for a rise fall is a push down effect. So let's say for or, if I rise on the first option, fall on the second option, I'm rising up to show that there's more, there's another option. I say or this. I fall to limit it. Remember we talked about the carrot and cutting off part of it. I'm pushing down, and that's what makes it feel complete or closed. It feels limited to those two options. And we also talked about how one of the reasons why you might rise and rise, if you're planning a meeting with somebody, you don't want it to sound imposing on them. You don't want it to sound heavy, like you're pushing down on them. Now again, depending on the exact context, just because you make an or statement doesn't necessarily mean it's imposing. But indirectly under the surface, there is sort of that, hey, this is what I'm limiting you to, pick one. The next case of rising and falling would be conditional statements. Now this one can also seem a little bit tricky when we look at some of the details, but this push down effect is still working. So for example, if I have time, I'll do it. If I have time, I'll do it. If we put the if part first, there's a comma, and you can rise a little bit more because of the comma, but you don't have to. How does the push down effect work here? Okay, we're saying if this is true, this is our basis, our starting point. If this, then that. So I'm saying, well, if this is the case, it will land here. So if I throw the ball this way, it'll land here, period. If I throw the ball this way, it'll land here. The push down effect comes because we're saying, well, if I throw it up this way, it's not going to land over there, right? That's that limitation. And it's sort of going to end up literally pushing down, falling down onto a particular point, a particular result. So you're not going to get some other result starting from this point, throwing it up this way. So it's a little indirect, it's a little more abstract, but it should make sense how we're still getting that push down effect, saying this is the result that it lands on. Another example, if you want to speak a language, you have to practice speaking. Instead of saying, if this, then that's the result, that's where the ball lands, we're saying, if this, you have to do that. So it is still landing on what you have to do, but it's also pushing down, it's cutting off or limiting everything else. So we're saying if this is the result you want, then you can't just choose anything, you have to do this specific thing. Note there are other things that we can do also, but this is the basic structure and we'll move on from there. Just like we saw with the or the list, how I said you could look at it as rise, fall as one piece, or you could look at it as rise and fall as two separate pieces. With a conditional statement, what happens if I say, if you have time, will you do it? Now the second part is a question, but now it's not rise and then fall, it's rise and then rise. Because of that, you could look at the rise and fall in a conditional statement as not actually a rise fall together. It's a rise and then a fall that would end a statement, or a rise and a rise that would end a question. Either way, you want to look at it as a rise and then a fall, at least for statements, or you want to look at it as a rise and then a separate fall. You could look at it that way too. It doesn't really matter, whichever way works best for you. Unfinished thoughts. Let's take a look at a couple examples so we have something to work with. You go to a restaurant and you order a meal that has rice, vegetables, and tofu. And after you eat, the waiter comes to get your place and they say, "How is the meal?" "Well, the rice was good." "Well, the rice was good." Compare this to "the rice was good." "The rice was good." That's just a basic statement. Maybe you're assuring the cook that it was actually good. "Well, the rice was good." Now there's a little bit of a special thing going on here. We are giving attentional intonation, the focus to a particular item of all the items in the meal. That aside, remember there's rice, vegetables, tofu. And the waiter asks, "How was the meal?" Which is all three. Now if I rise and fall on one of them, what I'm doing is I'm cutting off that list. These other things, these other items, were not good. So the effect that we get by highlighting one item and then cutting it off with that fall, that push down effect, is we're saying only the rice was good. So does that make sense how we get this limitation by pushing down and cutting off the other options? Another example, your friend writes a story and they want your feedback. So you start reading the story and at the beginning you're like, yeah, this is interesting, I like this, okay, this is cool. As you get more and more through the story, you kind of get a little bored, you're like, this isn't so good, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then your friend asks you, well, what do you think? You say, the beginning was good. Now again, what you're saying there is only the beginning was good. And then you're implying, well, the rest was not. And notice implying. Usually when we imply information, we rise. We've seen many cases of that. And that's because the rise points to the fact that there's more, even if we don't say it. But in this case, we're able to actually fall and imply information because, again, we're saying only this. So yeah, we're not rising to imply more, but the effect of the context and the effect of saying only this naturally implies not the other things. So this is actually where you can use a fall to imply more information, but usually when we imply information, we rise.